And the Patriot Act dramatically reduced restrictions on law enforcement agencies' ability to search telephone, email, communications, medical, financial, and other records of private citizens. But basically what happened at World War I, the immigrants' search for an economic existence in this country led to significant legislative acts. And these legislative acts implemented by Congress help us to understand the process that immigrants have had to go through to become a part of this community known as the United States of America. Because in almost all of these acts after World War I, passage was based on the fear of the other, the fear of the not me, the fear of the stranger at the gate. And let's recognize the fear factor when discussing issues that are related to the immigrant experience. And that immigrant restriction legislation is very important because it starts with the Palmer Raids. And the Palmer Raids were attempts by the United States Department of Justice to arrest and deport radical immigrants in the United States. So they're going to go after the radical whites. They're going to go after the radical white beans. And the arrests and raids occurred in November of 1919 and January of 1920 under the leadership of a reactionary attorney general, just like the one that we have today in terms of Jeff Sessions, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. Now, more than 500 foreign citizens are going to be deported, including a number of prominent leftist leaders such as Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman that you will be seeing in the documentary. Palmer's efforts were largely frustrated by officials at the U.S. Department of Labor who had responsibility for deportations and who objected to the Attorney General's disrespect for the legal process. The Palmer raids occurred, and this is similar to what's happening today with regards to Sessions and DACA. Palmer raids occurred in the larger context of what is known as the Red Scare in the United States. This was a term given to the fear and reaction against political radicals in the United States immediately following World War I when the Russians had their revolution. So let's take a look at a film clip that helps us understand the raids and to help us understand the Alien and Sedition Acts.
In the aftermath of the First World War, as the country began to think about what was meant by a, quote, return to normalcy, unquote, part of the agenda was to craft a more comprehensive social control form of immigration and deportation laws. And the laws that were developed in 1917 had both ideological components and criminal enforcement components. And in many ways, that was the first comprehensive sort of modern type of deportation law that we saw. And it arose out of a lot of loyalty controversies that had taken place during the war. And it also confirmed the role of the federal government and the bureaucratized model of deportation enforcement. So it started focusing on criminal aliens as well as focusing on people who were ideologically deemed to be subject to deportation, anarchists and socialists in particular. Those things sort of developed parallel together during that period. And I think the underlying idea was that there are certain people who are just not worthy of being members of American society, and even if they have been admitted legally, we should get rid of them. A lot of the discourse as it develops in the 1920s around these sorts of laws focuses on an alleged crime problem that was largely undertaken by non-citizens. When you actually read more sober studies of the period, you might really question whether there was such a crime wave. And also, you would notice that there were a lot of native-born American citizens who were engaged in criminal activities as well. But the public discourse began to shift, particularly with the rise of J. Edgar Hoover and the early FBI. The focus turned increasingly to deporting non-citizen criminal aliens, particularly those convicted of crimes involving moral turpitude, which was a category that was developed in those early laws, and also people with drug offenses. And so the mechanisms of deportation, the systems became increased, the funding became increased, the bureaucracy became much larger, and we started seeing more people being focused on. This continued into the 30s and the 1940s, and in many ways has continued to the present day.
Okay, so that particular film clip, and of course with regards to, again, the Espionage Act, the Alien and Sedition Act, the immigration restriction legislation. This is so important because the 1920s, well, we are reliving the 1920s. It was one of the most racist decades ever, yet everybody was consuming, and it was an urban society and all that jazz. But the 1920s is important for us because the 1920s is going to introduce some very restrictive legislation, and it was based on nativism. But this time, the nativism is the nativism, the beliefs that people have about non-white racial groups as well as Southern and Eastern Europeans. These beliefs become rigid in the 1920s, and they served as justification for certain actions. Now, the belief that one group is superior to another results in certain actions. And it is important to understand the underlying ideology on which an everyday level justifies these actions. That's why it's important for us to appreciate what's going on under the Trump administration, because we find the basis for these ideologies expressed by the media, by individuals, and in literature. And the 1920s gives us the laboratory by which to assess what's going on today. Now, ideology is a set of interrelated beliefs, values, attitudes, and norms that are used to explain and justify existing social relations. Basically, ideologies form a matrix by which people can explain behavior. How's that for matrix? How about that for Keanu Reeves? Because racism as an ideology isn't new, but because groups have always felt superior to other groups. But modern racism is different because it's the only form of racism with scientific vindication. And there have always been philosophies behind racism, but scientific racism has the guise of science. And so scientific racism was known as eugenics. And eugenics arose in the late 19th and early 20th centuries at a time when people of color were increasingly being exploited. And so when we take a look at these eugenics and the science of racism justified existing stereotypes and gave sustenance to broader policy choices. So why is eugenics so important? Because they influenced two of the most important immigration pieces of legislation, and that the National Origins Act of 1921 and 1924. Now, the reason why these most controversial acts, and this is very important, concerning immigration passed both houses of Congress, was related to these radical white immigrants, the radical white beings. The government did not like them. They were usually Italian, they were German, they were Jewish, socialists, they were anarchists. They did not like the idea of immigrants organizing for their rights into unions. And so in the 1920s, it was anti-union, anti-Italian, anti-Jewish. Of course, with regards to the blacks and people of color, there's still that. But remember, alien refers to Europeans at this time. And so the National Origins Act of 1921 and 1924 were passed in Congress. Congress was frightened by what was known as the Red Scare. There was a Russian Revolution in World War I, during World War I. Now, the radicalism practiced by white immigrant workers who wanted justice scared the business community. So when the 1920s began, those of you who know U.S. history, any union that espoused radical tendencies, especially the industrial workers of the world, the IWW or the Wobblies, was destroyed, as you're going to be reading in the chapter that's assigned for this particular beans. All radical immigrants are going to be deported, and the main leader of the Socialist Party, Eugene Debs, is going to be in jail. Strikes by workers are going to be beaten down by force. And so Congress in the 20s is going to put an end to the dangerous and turbulent flood of immigrants by passing laws setting immigration quotas. The quotas favored Anglo-Saxons, it kept out Africans and Asians, it limited the arrival of Italians, of Slavic people, and most importantly, Russian Jews. English, Protestant, and Irish are going to be favored over African, Chinese, and Eastern Europeans. So, the National Origins Act solidified what is known as the melting pot theory for white Americans. It ensured that there's a three-generational process of assimilation. Immigration in the 1920s became a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant privilege. And at the same time in the 1920s, the KKK is going to be revived and it spread into the North. So that by 1924, the KKK is going to boast 4.5 million members. So the warning sign to immigrants coming to America became centered In the decade known as the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, only WASPs apply. Now, what we have learned is that when you are in a disadvantaged position, you must organize for your rights. White beings have a history of protecting themselves from harm, and that history is all of us or none. That's very important to understand because these immigrants that came into the United States at that time are going to be attacked. They want their rights. They want to be represented. And so if we could go back and end this with Ray Charles's America the Beautiful,